people have debated about the definition for ages. Now, broadly, there are, I think, two and a half definitions, if I say so. First definition is basically equating economic development with economic growth. You know? So as far as output per capita grows is economic development. That's adopted by most neoclassical economists who form the vast majority of economic profession today. But then there's another definition, which has roots from the classical school and the Marxist school, and also what I call the developmentalist tradition. People like Alexander Hamilton, Friedrich List, and the so-called development economists of the 1950s and 60s, people like Simon Kuznets, Albert Hirschman, and so on. And in this the alternative traditions, economic development is defined not purely in terms of quantitative growth, but qualitative change. So this definition is based on the understanding of the economy mainly as something based in the sphere of production. So for these people, economic development is the economic development happens only when there is fundamental structural transformation in the productive structure of the economy, and also the underlying capabilities that make that productive transformation possible. So it's a much more nuanced and qualitative definition of economic development. So, you know, if Equatorial Guinea, which is actually at the moment the richest country in Africa because of oil, grew from an economy with $350 per capita income in the early 90s to a country with something like $22,000 per capita income. The standard neoclassical definition will classify it as an economic development, but you know, the people like Albert Hirschman or Friedrich List would say, no, that's not development, that's just quantitative growth. Yeah? And then I said 2.5 definitions because there has been more recently a variant of the neoclassical definition, which is apparently more progressive, but in the end even less forward-looking than the standard neoclassical definition. This is a definition that more or less equates economic development with poverty reduction. Now, the height of this definition was the so-called Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations, launched in the year 2000. And in this definition, well, they had different elements, but basically the economic development was equated with poverty reduction. So this is even less the kind of comprehensive definition than the standard neoclassical definition. So a lot of people, however, a lot of people subscribe to it because it was advancing this pro-poor agenda. You know, it was like, if we are growing quantitatively, but not reducing poverty, can we call that economic development? So it has a progressive element. But on the other hand, you know, this is a vision of the economy as something that is almost static. You know, I mean, you don't need structural transformation. You don't need growth in productive capabilities. All you need is to generate more income and, more importantly, redistribute it more fairly so that we eliminate abject poverty, which is usually defined as $2 a day. So it's a very narrow, defensive kind of definition. I mean, this is not strictly speaking the same as the neoclassical definition, but I mean, it is quite strongly linked to it because it is mainly about the people as consumers, what kind of incomes they have. is not about the transformation of the productive structure. It's not about people taking up different professions. I mean, turning themselves from subsistence farmers into manufacturing workers and so on. So it's that in that sense, it's rooted in the same worldview as neoclassical economics. These are just not academic theoretical differences because they give very different implications. So if you take what I call the productivist view, I mean the view that the essence of economic development is in the transformation of the productive sphere, then you will necessarily recommend economic policies that will encourage the accumulation of new technologies, acquisition of new skills by workers, transformation of the social arrangements to back that. So the most famous policy recommendation in this tradition is the so-called infant industry argument, the argument that governments of economically backward nations need to provide trade protectionism, subsidies, and other supports to young industries so that they can have the space to develop their productive capabilities and eventually catch up with the more advanced producers from abroad. Now, for this to happen, you would need to provide tariff protection. You might even need to ban the imports of certain foreign products. You might put restrictions on foreign direct investment. You might set up state-owned enterprises in large capital-intensive sectors with high risk because typically in developing countries there are no large capitalists that can take such risk in the beginning. So that you recommend these kind of things. If you took the neoclassical view where basically economic growth happens ultimately as a consequence of people trading. Yeah? So you want to buy better things and then you are ready to offer higher prices and entrepreneurs will spot the opportunity, produce new things. And in that world, also because you assume that technologies are freely available, everyone has the equals the productive capability. So if, for example, countries like Guatemala not producing things like BMWs, it's not because they cannot, but because it doesn't make economic sense. Yeah. So you have all these assumptions about the economy, which basically suggests that free trade and free market policies are the best. Yeah? At most, you'd provide some public goods like infrastructure and basic education. But beyond that, you don't really have to do anything other than keeping competition alive by opening your borders, by deregulating businesses, competition and market competition in the market provides the natural spur to economic growth, and whatever happens. I mean, the government has no business in directing people to set up a steel mill or start producing electronics equipment and so on. I mean, if you keep the markets open and free, economic development will naturally follow. So from these two different visions of how the economy works and develops in the long run especially, you'd come up with completely different sets of economic policies. Even in developed economies, the state plays a hugely important role. I mean, it's in virtually all countries, the single largest employer is the single largest organization. In some countries, public sector employment could account for as much as 25% of the total employment. In some countries, government spending could be equivalent to 50-60% of GDP. So the government is always playing a huge role. But in the early stages of economic development, the government has to play and has played a very important role in transforming the productive structure, because if you leave it to the market, basically very little is going to happen. I mean, you will keep specializing in what you already have, and it will be very, very difficult to move up the ladder, if you like, because there are already superior producers with vastly superior technologies, access to the management skills and the marketing channels and skilled workers out there who will immediately wipe you out if you don't have extra protection, which can only be provided by the government in those circumstances. So in the early stages of economic development, virtually all the countries have used state state intervention in a very heavy-handed way. I mean, this is the case also for countries like Britain and the United States, which most people think got developed on the basis of the free trade and free market. In some respects, actually, they were even more interventionist than the states of Germany or France or Japan, because it depends on the area of policy you look at, but basically when it comes to trade protection, these were the most protectionist economies in their respective catch-up periods. The United States especially, Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, or what would be called Finance Minister in other countries, actually invented the theory of infant industry protection. Between about the 1830s and the Second World War, the average tariff rate for manufactured imports in the United States hovered between 40 and 60%. Today, the typical developing country has a 10% tariff rate, and at the time during this 120-year period, the U.S. was literally the most heavily protected economy in the world. So actually, of course, different countries have used different tools in different combination, in different intensity, but virtually all countries have used interventionist measures. But the interesting thing is that when they get developed, they begin to see the world differently. They now realize that we don't need protection. Actually, why those other guys have protection? We need to dismantle them. And then they put pressure on other countries. They try to persuade other countries to dismantle this protection. And this is what the 19th century German economist Friedrich List, who is mistakenly known as the father of the infant industry argument, even though he only kind of developed the theory originally invented by Alexander Hamilton. This is what Friedrich List described as kicking out the ladder. Most obvious common feature in developing countries is that, well, not all of them, but in most of them, but in the early stage of development, the landlords are very powerful. And they don't want economic development, they want to be able to export their agricultural products or things like that to be able to import the finer consumer goods from the US or Europe. And this pattern has always existed. Look at the United States. Why was the U.S. Civil War fought in the 1860s? Part of it was slavery, but another important part was that the North and the South couldn't agree on trade policy. The northern states, which are trying to develop manufacturing, wanted infant industry protection against European imports. The southern states said that this is stupid. We can export cotton and tobacco, of course, using the slaves to Europe and import manufactured products which are much better and cheaper, even considering the transportation costs, than the American ones. Why should we subsidize these inefficient Yankee producers? So there's a big tension from very early on, and finally this erupted into the Civil War. So it was only because the North won the Civil War that Americans could pursue this protectionist policy with greater force. Yeah, and some would say that the North won the Civil War only because they had the manufacturing industries that could produce better weapons. The southern states were agrarian, didn't have those. I had to import them from Europe. They couldn't keep it up. So my friend, the Norwegian economist Eric Reinert, once said that Latin America is the United States in which the South won the Civil War. So the landlords kept ruling. They didn't want industrialization. So this is a very typical problem. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the landlords are the only problems. If you look at, for example, the Brazil or South Africa today, you can see that it's the financiers that are really killing off manufacturing industries, because they want stronger currency, they want high interest rate. Manufacturing industries have collapsed in these two countries in the last 20, 30 years because the financiers became dominant and basically that implemented policies that are very detrimental to the manufacturing industry. Until the late 1980s, manufacturing sector accounted for close to 30% of Brazil's GDP. Today is 10%. I studied economics in the early 1980s in South Korea, and most of our professors were neoclassical economists, although compared to today's neoclassical economists, they were much milder. But the reason why I started looking at other approaches was because I just couldn't reconcile what I was taught in the classroom with what was happening around me. At the time, South Korea was going through its miracle growth period. The economy growing at 8, 10, 12% every year. Massive social transformation, positive and negative, and the huge conflicts. Workers going on a strike, students going on demonstration, riot police coming in to bash people. Huge conflict. And then in the classroom, the professors were saying all changes are marginal, everything is in equilibrium. I couldn't take it seriously, so I started looking around. I started looking around to see whether there are other things. And luckily at the time we still had a few kind of old professors who were institutionalists of the old kind, and some had some Marxist influence. So I realized that there were these other things, and then started. It wasn't just me. Many of my friends were looking for answers that they were not getting in the classrooms. So we were reading different things and studying different things, and then I decided to come and study in Cambridge, which at the time had a huge range of different sort of non-neoclassical economists. Of course, the majority were Keynesian, but there were other people that with influences from Marx and the Austrians and whatnot. So when I got here, I got to see an even broader horizon, and then that made me very aware that there isn't just one approach. There isn't an approach that is superior to all the other approaches on everything, and that has made me a pluralist.